So first of all, maybe a few words about myself. So because I mean, I'm not sure what the backgrounds of everybody here is, because we have Agile in so many different fields. And of course, Agile is done in a very different way depending on where you work. I personally come from data. I was a scientist a long time ago, more like bioinformatics. After this, I spent my first half of my career as a data scientist in quite a few startups. After this, I switched to this very interesting title called data strategy. So feel free to ask him about that one. I've heard this raise a lot of questions normally. And this is the title between business and data, basically trying to make sure that we get value of data projects. After this, I managed to end up being a CTO. I did a data strategy for organization, and they hired me then to lead the whole thing. So at that point, I really had to learn how to manage software projects as well. And after this, I also ended up again in consulting, doing data strategy, and I'm actually a CTO one more time now for one of our portfolio companies. So in my background, you can see I'm very focused on data, but I do know a few things about software. I have 2 books so far. One of them is quite technical, it's Python R for the modern data scientist, for all of you who are interested in data. The second one could be more interesting for this group, because it's focused about data strategy and how do we do that. And the whole third part of that book is really focused on delivering data strategy. And a lot of the ideas that you learn today actually are also there. Separate from this, I also did some research on explainable AI, and I'm mostly like technical person, but have quite some experience in management. But maybe the first thing which I always like to do, I mean, you have the agenda here. I'll try to explain a few words about data strategy. But before this, I always have this disclaimer. Almost every presentation I do, I try to explain what are the dangers of listening and following my advice. I know it's a bit counterintuitive, but I always try to kind of frame what I talk about, because I think some of the things we talk about can be dangerous, and you'll see why. Then I'll talk a bit about data strategy, because as I mentioned, doing data projects, managing them, whether you do Agile and Lean or both, it's quite different from software. So you have to a bit understand where I'm coming from. Then we'll do a very short trip about the history of the Lean movement. We'll do some definitions. At the end, this is the part which I think everybody wants to be here and to see actually what do we do and how does that work with Agile. The first thing, and by the way, my images are taken like I used generative AI for them. I mean, you can see normally they don't work very well with fingers. So I was pleasantly surprised I could get like an image of somebody sculpturing something. This picture is very important because the whole Lean movement is focused on removal of waste. And I ended up reading about Lean much later, before I understood about one philosophical movement. There's a very interesting economist and philosopher called Nassim Taleb. He's from Lebanon, and he wrote very interesting books on statistics. And the Black Swan, for example, Anti-Fragile, and such books. And he always talks about this philosophy by subtraction. So sometimes, and I'll give you this very interesting example, there are situations where a positive advice is not very useful. For example, if you talk to your parents and you ask them, so how do we, what should they do to have a successful life? And they'll tell you, work very hard, get a very good job as a manager or something. And then I remember from my history, I mean, I always looked at this advice and I thought, okay, this sounds very good, but what do I do about this? It didn't feel very actionable. On the other hand, and this is what Nassim Taleb talks about, via negativa, which means a negative path. If you provide like negative advice, you say actually what you shouldn't do to have a very successful life. For example, you can say, be friends with the wrong people, or be lazy, or don't pay attention to your health. These are very concrete things normally. And these are also very actionable. So this is the philosophy of work and life that I have been interested for a long time. And I think actually this forms the foundation of the Lean movement. So maybe I'll go to that one next, but I'll be referring to this quite a lot today because I think this is a very productive way to think about things. Now, with my words of caution, I mentioned there's a few dangerous things, and all of you come from the Agile movement, and one of the big criticisms in Agile is this a cargo code? I mean, I hope you have heard about this, but I'll still tell this story. A cargo code is a phenomenon which occurred after the Second World War, when the Americans were supplying islands in the Pacific with supplies, and the local population became very reliant on those supplies: food, drinks, medicine, everything of that sort. Eventually, the war ended, and the U.S. Army, they moved on, and the local population didn't know what to do, and they expected, if they start building airports made of basically plants, bamboo, and things like this, that the shipments will start arriving again. So basically, and they started to build basic airplanes made from straws and things like this, which sounds very crazy to us, but if you look from that point of view, they associated the appearance of goods with airports and airplanes. So this is actually what happens very often with frameworks such as Agile and Lean. We tend to think they're a great idea because a lot of smart people do them, but the danger becomes just copying and pasting them in your organization without thinking. Yeah, and this is what I mean when I say cargo code, because this is exactly the most dangerous thing we can do. The fact that some framework works for Google doesn't mean it's going to work for your organization, and it doesn't matter if that's Lean or Agile. Because, for example, in the example of Google, there's a lot of other factors which are not present in your organization, right? So these are normally resources, knowledge, financials. So when I talk about the framework today, pay attention to seeing how does that really fit your organization. So the perfect framework doesn't exist. It's always a bit like a finger pointing at the moon. It's not the real answer sometimes. You need to be very careful. So implementing Lean and Agile in some organizations could be the last thing that you want to do. With that out of the way, let's move on a bit on data strategy, because a lot of my examples will be focused on this, and I have two definitions for that. One is this a bit more easy one, I would say. That's basically everything the data scientists and engineers are doing, which is not writing code. Yeah, this is how they manage their projects. This is how they report things. This is how they decide what to do. And this is how they estimate their stories. The fancy way to say data strategy is basically having a dynamic plan for executing data initiatives. Yeah, so I mean, technically, every company should have a data strategy. I mean, nowadays people talk about data and AI strategy, but that's the basic idea, right? The keyword here is dynamic, and I think this keyword I'm going to take to the next slides because it's very important to when you implement new frameworks. Now, the place where Agile and Lean come in data strategy is in the StratOps method. So basically, how we used to do data strategy before, it was very like somebody makes a static slide deck, 100 slides full of plans, and it costs maybe 200,000 euros. Normally, you buy it from a management consultancy firm, and then nothing happens. Yeah, because this is just like nobody follows those ideas, and till the time somebody needs to implement the strategy, the whole market has changed. Yeah, I can give you the example. If you did like some kind of a technical strategy in the spring of last year before the whole GPT stuff, you might need to revise it very quickly. So I'm not the only one advocating for this. There's an organization actually in Germany called Taival, which are responsible for making StratOps quite popular. But basically, once we need to do strategies which are dynamic and they take feedback. And I think all of you from Agile should appreciate the idea of having short feedback loops. So basically, when we do data strategy and any actually strategy, we try to make it in a way that it can be adjusted based on feedback. And this is a very important idea when we do data strategy. And here, maybe some of the boxes are a bit small, but this is the 3D mode of data strategy where you focus on first understanding the situation. right? Which I call due diligence. You before making a plan, you need to know what's going on, and only after this you can design the plan. And at the end, and this is the delivery part, this is where you really have to implement things, and this is where Lean and Agile come. But before this, there's a lot of understanding about the business, a lot of alignment in all of this, and the design is basically preparing that static document. The dynamic part comes from delivery. And I'll jump very, yeah, we have a question from Michael. Yes, maybe talking Nicole, we'll provide the slides after that. So let's focus on delivery. And as I mentioned, we want to avoid having a static plan, but we do need a static plan at the beginning. I mean, then somebody needs to prepare a deck. The most important thing in any business, I mean, in software, in business, in e-commerce, doesn't matter where you are at the end, we do want to get some measurable value, right? This is to the right. What happens between the strategy and the value generation is the key for our conversation today. And when I was writing the book on data strategy, I was thinking about, first I was thinking about Agile, because I always, and everybody in my field wonder, does Agile work for data projects? I mean, all of us can agree that it works for software projects. I mean, you could always argue that it's a bit like democracy. It's not perfect, but it's the best thing that we have. But all of us can agree, compared to waterfall, this is a great idea. And in conversations with a lot of leaders in data and AI, I came to the conclusion that Agile does work, but in a soft way. And I will mention exactly what I mean by that later, but I'm just mentioning because if you read here soft Agile, this is coming, the definition. We do need to manage a portfolio of several projects at the same time. So this is very common between software and data projects. And at some point, I decided to add the Lean methodology also here, because data projects are very wasteful. I would argue they're less wasteful than software projects, but they still generate, software projects are a bit less wasteful, but there's still a lot of things that can be optimized. Now, coming back to that software Agile idea, nobody who I interviewed quite a lot of people for that book, and nobody ever said Agile is perfect for data. There's zero. Everybody basically said, some people did say this is a really bad idea to try to do Agile in data teams, but most of the people agree that, yeah, we should use this, but let's adjust this a little bit. And I know you guys are the experts. I'm not like the best expert on Agile, but still, what I have seen what worked for my teams, also as a CTO, is that we can try to focus less on estimation of stories for data projects, because things are very unpredictable. For example, if you try to build some kind of machine learning models, sometimes you don't know, do you have the right data? What is the quality of things? You know, do we even build the right things? So things are very unpredictable. And often what I always try to do, we do need to invent new types of stories. I mean, in Jira, obviously we have tasks, we have stories, we have bugs. But in terms of data teams, I try to add new stories, for example, research, because somebody trying to research a new tool, maybe we should try to also track that. And I would say for data projects, you do need to spend a lot of effort in sprint planning and retrospectives. Because a lot of things are unclear, and the key from this slide that you need to understand is I come from a field where we have a lot of waste, and this will be a pattern through the talk today. We do a lot of things unproductively in data. Now, the Lean methodology, and here I used a very nice, I think it came out very well, the generative AI here, like basically a waste processing plant. The whole point of the Lean methodology is we try to get rid of waste. Yeah, I mean, how you have industrial waste and you want to use it for some other purpose, you try to remove things normally. Still, what it has in common with Agile is at the end we do want to maximize customer value, right? But instead of focusing that much on feedback loops and being very, very quick with things and testing things, we're only focusing on removing waste. This is the only focus. So this is the most important thing. If you get today, is Lean is about removing things. Now, it sounds very simple removing things, but if you don't know which things to remove, you might remove something which is actually important. Because you see the second point here, right? Identify, eliminate non-value added activities. And you see immediately somebody will ask, what is a value added activity, right? What part of our business actually makes money and is useful? And this is a very, very good question, yeah? The hard part of the job is not actually eliminating things, but deciding what to eliminate. So I would say this is the hardest part about Lean. The culture of continuous improvement, I would also say that this actually is very agile inspired, right? We do want at the end to create some kind of a big feedback loop. So if we remove something, we improve some kind of a process by removal. How do we know it was a good idea or not? And here I think the combination between Lean and Agile becomes very interesting. But we'll get to that in a second. Now, those two methodologies are similar, right? They do overlap, and I'll be very honest with you. There's some things which are redundant. Yeah, I would say around 20% between those two methodologies, they do overlap. For example, we also always need to improve process in both of them. Process is very important, still a little bit more important for Lean. Both have a cultural angle to them, I would say, and both are interdisciplinary, right? When you do Agile, we try to bring people from different teams together. For Lean, it's absolutely the same. You can't improve processes by just for example, talking to your front-end developers, yeah? Normally, you do need to talk to transdisciplinary teams. So I think this is something very common between both of them. Feedback loops are also common between both of them. Still, there's two very, very, very key differences, and this is again an important slide. The first one is the mindset, and I mentioned already, Lean is just focused on waste. There's a singular focus of Lean, removing things, while Agile is focused a bit more on being adaptable. This, I think, is more about the definition, but the second point about the approach makes this difficult to implement, right? So, for example, if you are very inspired by what I say today, and tomorrow you go to your teams and say, okay, let's do something about this, here you might have a problem, because Lean requires a lot of due diligence, yeah? While with Agile, I can tell you, I mean, the second time I became a CTO, the first things which I actually did were implementing a very strict Agile approach. So I didn't need to know a lot about the business. I didn't need to know a lot about the technology to implement Agile. I mean, I basically the team there didn't have like a very structured feedback loops approach, right? So it was very hard to understand who works on what, you know, who is responsible for what things. There were basically no feedback loops. So I didn't need to understand anything about the business to make a positive change. And I say this is a really big win for Agile. For Lean, that's just not possible. Even if you're really inspired by this talk today, you'll see that you can't just go tomorrow and implement this, because you need to understand the process. And I'll show you in a bit like what I mean by this. So this is a different approach, and this is a very key difference. The final difference is related to that one, is this focus, right? So with Lean, we are actually working with the whole company. Yeah, I mean, normally these value generating processes, they go across departments. If you're a very big organization, this will be hundreds of people involved in this, yeah? And I would say in most Agile projects, I mean, you have less people, right? I mean, the organizing Agile in a big organization, there's special methods for this, I'm sure you know better, but it's a bit more isolated. While for Lean, we didn't need to look at the whole organization. And this is also dangerous because we might lose focus, you know, we might try to do too much, basically. Now, let's look at those definitions side by side. Again, minimizing waste. I know I'm repeating myself, but it's very important. We focus on the processes with Lean, and we optimize the entire value stream. With Agile, we try to be very flexible, very adaptive, and very iterative. Now, a skill that you need when you work with Lean is systems thinking. And this is, I mean, I am a technical person by background. I'm not sure about all of you, but I think probably there's a mix. And my experience with talking to technical people is once I mention systems thinking, everybody would roll their eyes and say, this is just another management crap that, yeah, we don't need. This is wrong specifically once you do lean. This is a very good definition. I'm not going to read this. I can recommend when you get the slides, read the paper by this guy. He works for the Department of Defense in the US, and he has the best definition of systems thinking. Instead of this, I'll focus on a very concrete example of systems thinking. And for example, in Lean, let's imagine we want to understand the process, the value generating process of a big company. Yeah? And I mentioned this is like, probably if you need to describe it in a document, you can write a whole book with this. You can write 200 pages explaining how Zalando sells clothes, right? This is not productive. Nobody has the time for this. And one very valuable skill once you work there is working on different levels of abstraction, for example. Instead of focusing only on the low-level details, you try to focus a bit higher, right? Instead of understanding every small thing about the business process, you look at kind of like a middle ground, perhaps. And here I have example from a chessboard, because in chess you do this all the time. You try to focus on very small details, at the same time you focus on the big picture. And this is a very important systems thinking skill. It requires, I would say, mostly experience, and you have to be confident with deciding on things that you don't understand. And I would say any project manager understands that you don't understand 100% of what your team is building. And I think there's even calculations that you can understand only what 7 people are doing all the time. The feedback loops that we have in Agile, also in Lean, like it's a fundamental systems thinking, understanding, and dealing with black boxes. I mean, you'll be working with teams, with systems that nobody probably understands 100%. So this is something actually that you can train for, but is a key skill in what we do. Now, finally, let's go a bit into Lean. And there's no coincidence that it's, I would say, it's developed in Japan. I mean, they did what we had in Germany, we call Stunde Null in Germany, like the 0 hour, basically, that the whole society and economy needed to get a restart. So they had like, after the devastation of the Second World War, they had the clean slate to do things better, yeah? And they had the foresight to try something new. And there's some specific people that I mentioned here. There's many more. But one of the wonders in Japan was the Toyota company. Of course, still very big, one of the biggest auto manufacturers in the world. They just wanted to build cars. And they wanted to build cars with minimal waste. Why I find it interesting? It was invented in Japan because it's, I mentioned like the philosophy at the beginning with via negativa. I mean, Zen Buddhism is also about actually removal of waste and focus, so it's very interesting. But I think the reasons for the Lean methodology were actually not religious at all. They were just focused on having a good output. Now, they didn't have a lot of resources back then. I mean, the US and other countries did support Japan, but they didn't have that much to work with, yeah? And they had to do the best they could with the little that they had, yeah? And the big focus there was this Toyota production system, which is basically a conveyor belt system to do things very quickly. And from this, the Lean movement came. But let me illustrate this with an example. And here I have the first big diagram, which you don't need to read, to be honest, in detail. You can look at it in the slides later, but I just give you one innovation from here, because there's a lot of things to unpack. There's really great book, and I have some here nice timelines. But the one important idea is the just-in-time delivery. Yeah? I mean, you hear this actually. It's funny that we need to think about this when we talk about software, but imagine you have like a conveyor belt in a factory, and you have different units operating in different parts of the floor, and these are ultra specialized. Yeah, I mean, nowadays also in software, you rarely have like generalists. I mean, we do have full stack developers, but normally you have front-end developers, mobile developers, back-end developers, data engineer, data scientists, and UX people, let's say. And roughly, people specialize very deeply. So we do have the specialization of labor in technical projects. Now, In a factory, again, these people are super specialized. So the person who is assembling the wheel in Japan at that time, in the 50s, they had no idea about painting cars. So you couldn't take this person and just tell them like how it was before the invention of the conveyor belt, where basically people just gather together and build a car, you know, which is extremely inefficient. So you have this specialization of labor. Now, the most inefficient thing which happened there is that the people who were doing the wheels, they were very fast. Imagine this, and they make the wheels very fast. But then the people who needed to paint the wheels, it took them a bit longer. The result is around the people who are painting, it was full. You can see, imagine a big mountain of wheels which are not ready. And everybody down the line is just waiting for the car. Yeah, the whole conveyor belt basically stops because you have this local bottleneck. I am sure all of you have stories from agile management where everybody's waiting perhaps for the backend developer to finish something. Yeah, you planned everything greatly, but everything depends on the backend developer. And even if you do 1 week sprints and you're very productive, people just wait. So this is the same problem, yeah? You do want to have the just-in-time delivery. So basically, imagine your front-end developer is able to work immediately when the back-end developer is done and they're not waiting. This is the only thing which I'll mention here, because this is such a fundamental idea for everything we talk about, waiting. Maybe I'll go very quickly here. I mean, Lean, after this came, there's some very great books. All of you know the Kanban methodology, right? It also comes from Japan. The Lean Startup is a very fundamental book from Eric Rice. Basically, the idea is startups are like Toyota was in the 50s in Japan. They didn't have resources, and they wanted to be efficient. So it's not surprising that book came out of there. But if there's one book I can recommend, is that one. But to be honest, I want to skip a bit ahead. And I know some topics I leave unresolved, but I'll resolve them in time. Just remember what I said about waiting. Now, the title of this presentation was Knowledge Factory. And I mean, many people could say that Knowledge Factory, what do you mean by Knowledge Factory? It sounds very strange. Probably the word factory, you understand what I talked about Toyota. I do think we can run, we at least should try to, our goal standard should be trying to run, to be as efficient as possible in our management, yeah? I don't think we can automate and be like super distributed when we do very creative work with coding, which it is a bit different than assembly of cars, but we should try to do that. And now, big criticism which I always get when I talk about automation of knowledge work is people saying, yeah, but it's creative, it's complex, you know, how can we measure things? I mean, I do agree to some extent, but if you do, there is a middle ground. And here's one of my favorite methods, which maybe also many of you know, which is kind of between being very qualitative and being quantitative, right? So we try to be not super numerical. So because remember, if you want to have a factory, you do want to measure things. And that's the challenge that we have in software. Like, how do we measure the productivity and what needs to be done? And the KPI value tree starts with a very vague goal, be healthy, for example, which is, there's nothing you can do when somebody says that. It's exactly the example at the beginning we just said. Now, you can break this down. Normally, this will be, for example, imagine you're Zalando, and the goal will be here, the strategic goal is sell more clothes in Europe. It's not actionable at all for anybody involved. But then you can break this down. Yeah, what do we need to sell more clothes in Europe? Or in this example, what do we need to be healthy? And you can see these things become a bit more measurable, maybe, like so eat well, for example. Yeah, I mean, still not super measurable. But if you go to the right side, you will end up eventually with very concrete things. You can end up with like a body mass index, weight, and other similar things. So I give this here as an example that it is possible to measure knowledge work. It's very hard, it's very dangerous, but we can have some indicator, our teams, do they perform well or not? Yeah, I mean, of course, we can measure how many story points they churn every sprint. And all of you know this is not an exact science. Sometimes it's more art than science, but it does mostly work. So keep that in mind. And this is the combination between Lean and Agile in one diagram. And I'm very open to feedback on this one, because especially from the Agile movement, maybe I get criticism, because I always think that Lean is within the team and Agile is what happens between the team and the environment, yeah? So in the environment, you have management, you have other teams, and you have the broader world, for example, customers, yeah? What happens there, I call Agile, and what happens within the team, this is our knowledge factory, this is called Lean. The process that you want to optimize are in the team. Now, combining them, I'll skip this one actually, because I just want to actually focus on the challenges. The challenges in combining both of them is because the mindset, what I mentioned at the beginning, these are very, they just require a lot of preparation. But let me actually skip completely because we don't have too much time, and I realize this. Let's talk about waste, because I talked about waste already for half an hour, but I didn't give examples. Let me give you examples. This is a diagram I prepared. You have a sprint from left to right. On the left, you start the sprint, and here are the people participating in the sprint: data analysts, engineers, scientists. Now, this is for a data project. It's similar for other projects. So the deliverables are the circles. The bombs are failure, where the project basically dies, and the arrows are stress. Yeah, and the arrows pointing from the person giving the stress to the person receiving the stress. Yeah. So what happens when you start a data project sprint normally? At the beginning, I mean, we define our stories, we define what needs to be done, we do Agile. Yeah. Unfortunately, even with the best plan, suddenly we realize we're dependencies. The data engineer is asked by the data scientist, give me some data, yeah? And the data engineers needs to drop their work and, now look for data for the data scientists. Even if they manage to do this, then the data analyst needs data access. And data engineer, again, drops the work and they need to do something else. After this, the data scientist provides some kind of a prototype which just works on their laptop, and then the data engineer needs to recall all of this. That's why I have a bomb, because then the project can die. All this time, you see the business owner at some point starting to ask questions. What's going on? Why are you guys not finishing your stories? I mean, I thought it's clear what we need to do. Then things get delayed. Things cannot be deployed because the data scientists wrote code in a weird way. And finally, the worst problem is that what it was built wasn't required. So that's a bit of a different problem. But basically, this is a map of waste in data projects. All of these are things which you cannot, I think, are relatively tricky to catch with Agile. I mean, you can, as I mentioned, Lean and Agile have this overlap, but Lean is just focused on identifying this stuff, yeah? So this is why I realized I need to do this methodology. Now let's get a bit technical with Lean. The stuff which I showed you, we need to remove. And basically in Lean, we talk about information, we talk about material, and we talk about time. This is a real value stream map. And this is what you need to build for your organization. I mean, this is actually made for a concrete example where an organization is having not a digital product, but like a real analog product, which needs to be assembled by shipping things, building them together, and selling them to the customer, yeah? The key point you need to realize, there's waste in information because people don't communicate enough. There's waste in material because people, as I mentioned, somebody waits with a pile of wheels next to them, or there's a waste in time. Somebody's waiting for access. So this is what you need to see. But a diagram like this, you need to build first. And this takes a lot of time, and you need the whole organization almost. Now, here is a visualization of this. And this is very interesting because you can literally measure this. You can take a look at your software team and try to draw something like this. And again, try to have this horizon, and everything above this horizon is work, everything below the horizon is waiting for things. And I just talk about waiting. I don't talk about other sources of waste. In data projects, there's a lot of waiting. You can see this, yeah? And this, as I mentioned, waiting for finding the right data set, because you need to search for this. You're waiting for some access. You're waiting for the IT team to give you some resources, some, I don't know, cloud services provision that you need. Somebody needs to install your the software stuff before you actually can do something. There's this recoding part here, and then yeah. And this, I'll be honest with you, once I saw this, I started to see this everywhere. And the numbers, I would argue, for most big organizations around that amount. I would say our efficiency, where you can see how much we work versus how much we wait in data projects, is around that for big companies. And this is also measurable. Then you can go to your organization and ask, if somebody doesn't want you to do a data strategy or look at or apply lean, you can tell them, let's measure the efficiency, let's calculate the salaries, and let me give you a number for this. Now I'll go a bit into concrete sources of waste, because one was waiting, and here I was very creative with generative AI as well. Another typical source of waste is that actually somebody didn't finish their work. You know, imagine maybe the web designer wrote like HTML and CSS, but then the front-end developer who needs to connect the JavaScript to this, you know, needs to, and the web designer says, I'm done, basically. But the front-end developer realizes, no, you're not done, because we still need to finish this to make sure that I can work, yeah? So this is a very typical things which happen in software as well. Basically, people not finishing their work and giving it this off. Now, this is very similar, and here I have this picture of misty mountains, because the problem which I mentioned before, partially don't work, is that nobody defined what work means, you know? Nobody sat down and said, what do we mean by finished work, this definition of done? And this is probably one of the most typical software sources of waste, because this takes a lot of time. You don't feel like you're working, and it feels like bureaucracy. But somebody sitting down and defining what do we mean by finished product needs to do it. Otherwise, people start to build different things. So this is a very typical source of waste. Now here I have a Swiss Army knife. We call this in software scope creep. Basically, people work, and then somebody from management comes and says, let's build one more thing in the middle of the sprint. Yeah, that's, I mean, in Agile, all of you know, this is the one of probably the biggest crime you can commit in Agile framework. It's the same for Lean as well. It has a bit of a different angle here, I would say. Let's take the example. You try to build some kind of a dashboard, but it's so full of stuff, nobody, you know, people didn't focus on the critical things. I mean, it's an unwritten rule that 20% of your features correspond to 80% of the value, yeah? So a big source of waste is building things which are way too big, you know? You build software which is just does things which nobody actually really needs. So this is a very common source of waste. Now, another source of waste is unfinished work. This is typical for data science teams. Basically, you know, this is it works on my machine problem. Multitasking, and here I think if you count the fingers, the generative AI messed up actually. But the multitasking is again a typical problem. The data engineer, remember, needs to talk to 20 people instead of working. Waiting, I already talked about. Extra motion is very interesting one, and I'll give you another example that what I mentioned here is like, if you need to search something in a browser, many people, probably not you because all of you are mostly technical, many people take the mouse and click in the URL bar, yeah? So this probably takes you 2 seconds, and it doesn't seem like a lot of time, but instead of this, you can do Control L on Windows, so you can do Command L on Mac, and you get immediately there, and you can search. And this is what I mean by waste from extra motion. If you do such small things all the time, they pile up a lot, actually, right? So extra motion basically means doing manual things which actually you don't need to do. And this is also very common. Defects, I'm not going to go into them because everybody knows about broken things. Another waste which we have in software, it's if, for example, you have the backend developer, you tell them, can you do front-end work, you know? This is not utilizing your talent properly. A lack of knowledge sharing. big sources of waste, lack of documentation, big sources of waste. I'm skipping a little bit because I do want to get to some other methods. And this is this is one of my favorite methods, which I want to explain. What we have here is the Gaudi Cathedral in Barcelona, which is famous. If you haven't been there, you should visit it, but it's a cathedral which I think is still not finished. They tried, I think it spent 700 years to do that. Beautiful piece of work, but they didn't finish it. And it took 700 years. How many people need to do it? In software, we normally want, our management wants something like a Gaudi Cathedral all the time. And probably they're not going to wait for 700 years. But imagine the situation where somebody requires you to build such a thing, but you don't have resources. And as I mentioned, Lean can help you. And I talked about the value stream. And this is a concrete example of a value stream map for a software project, for a software product, sorry. Now I made a big mistake. This is a software product. Now, any software product, you have some kind of a user authentication, you have some kind of, like, let's talk about SaaS products. You have some user authentication, you have stuff in the middle where people, your users, do something on the product, and then you have like the payment at the end, yeah? This is a very typical user journey, it's also called. Now, the Gaudi Cathedral is normally what you get when your management buys a user journey from an external consultancy, because they'll build you amazing things and they'll bill you many hours to do this. They'll tell you, okay, here, this is amazing, beautiful product, now it's your job to build it. This is not agile and this is not lean. There's nothing you can do with this. What you need to do, and here, as I said, you have the 3 phases. You need to find what is critical in your product, yeah? Instead of building, for example, let's take the user authentication. Instead of having just like username and password, management says, yeah, but we need people to be able to log in with GitHub, with Amazon, with Microsoft. It's your job then as a manager to say, no, this is waste. We need first to build a product from A to B so we can measure this. And this is an agile idea, remember. And then we can iterate, yeah? So this is the agile and lean combined, because once you define what your critical flow is, it's super basic authentication, super basic service features from the product, and super basic payment, you can start measuring the success of your product, yeah? And then you can go further. Now you can be agile. Now you can do whatever the second batch of sprints, and then you can iterate, because you take this critical component, and now you can start building your cathedral, right? Because you have the different, you already have the critical flow. Now you can add the optional things, because you already validated the product with the market. Again, it's in the Agile Manifesto. And then you can also focus on, you know that the product delivers value, and now you can add the additional things which give incremental value. Now, I'll give one other example, because I think I'll just spend like maybe 5 more minutes before we have some questions. This is a very interesting example of waste as well. This is a picture of a painting of Napoleon. When we talk about strategy versus tactics, sometimes there's a lot of waste in making big plans, right? And this is, again, the reason why waterfall ended, basically, is because people did this really big plan with hundreds of developers that need to gather around from the whole company and sit down on 1 week and deploy together. That was in the 80s. You know, I know some people from that generation, they still have nightmares. That's where Agile came from. We can't have a big strategy and then things normally break. So with Napoleon, one innovation that they did, that he generous did, was at that time they didn't have telegraph phones. So obviously there was no way to communicate. Basically from Napoleon, he generous to the soldier, you get some person on a horse, you give them a piece of paper, then they go to the armies and they tell them what to do. Napoleon still had a strategy to do things. They still had a big strategy, yeah, but they weren't very agile. And the way they became agile is they gave a set of simple rules called heuristics. Basically, the general said, if you as a soldier at some point don't have clear orders from a general or a messenger for 4 hours, you should do 3 things. You should listen to where the sounds of battle are and go there. If you don't have this, you go to step 2, then you climb on a hill. And I actually don't remember the third one, but it's a very simple set of rules that people should follow in the absence of a big strategy. So in that sense, you have this very distributed command structure, and they can avoid this waste as well. I think it's a very interesting example. Maybe I can skip about this and move on maybe to some questions. Actually, but this is the recommendation of the book which I mentioned. The Lean Startup, I think, is one of the, it's one of the first books I ever read about startups. It's the whole MVP idea comes from there. How can you be very quick? I think for this, maybe many of you have read this, but if you want to combine Lean and Agile, that's the book. And maybe my closing remarks, actually, before we go into questions, is that, I'll be happy if you look at the books. If you want a free copy, always sure you can reach out to me. I had some podcasts recently where I talk about some related topics what I talk about today. I have a Substack. You can follow this. I do write about Lean from time to time, but if you want to follow a bit more, you can just go to my website and just follow me there. So with that in mind, I think I'm done with the presentation. So if you have any questions, maybe we can do them now.